Hey friend, welcome back to the Vision Driven Health Podcast, your go-to show for learning how to create healthy habits that last in partnership with the God who created you. I am very excited for you all to listen to this episode. I've got Andy Felton back. He's the author of Nourished by Design, a Christ-centered approach to nutrition. He was just on the show a few weeks ago, and in that conversation, it was very clear that we needed a follow-up episode to go dive deeper into the conversation on the specifics and practicals of nutrition. So in today's episode, we hit a lot of big questions about whether or not God cares about what we eat. We got into the theological, biological, and environmental aspects of eating meat, and we even got into the primary driver of chronic disease. It's such a good conversation, and honestly, it only scratches the surface of what you can find in Andy's book, which will be in the show notes. But without further ado, let's get into it. Do you find yourself struggling to consistently implement healthy habits? Do you lack energy, confidence, and motivation because of stress, overwhelm, and shame for having not gotten it together by now? Friend, there is hope and grace for your health. Hey, I'm Robin Ryan McDonald, host of the Vision Driven Health Podcast. I'm a follower of Jesus, a wife, a mama of two, and a seminarian turned health coach. And I'm so excited that you're here. I found myself in my early 20s captive to cravings and convenience. 20 pounds heavier, super tired, with a face full of acne. I could not figure out how to maintain healthy habits until I discovered the power of aligning my choices with God's vision. 10 years and 2 kids later, by the grace of God, I'm still prioritizing my health and feeling amazing. If you are over quick fixes and are ready to feel good in your own skin, then grab a giant water bottle and let's dive on in. As a reminder, the Vision Driven Health Podcast is under the umbrella of Naval Health Incorporated. The content on this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not intended for medical advice. It does not take the place of medical advice or treatment from a physician. Listeners should consult their own doctor or a qualified healthcare professional for specific health concerns and questions. I have gotten a lot of messages and requests for simple, easy protein-packed recipes. It's literally one of the number one requests that I get. And honestly, it's a great request because with all the busyness of life and juggling all the things, it's extremely helpful to have simple, easy options for home-cooked healthy meals. So I give to you for absolutely no cost at all the 20 and 20 recipe guide. This has 20 recipes that take only 20 minutes of effort to put together. And each recipe provides portions that hit 30 grams of protein. Amen, right? You can grab this awesome resource at visiondrivenhealth.com/resources. Hey friend, we have a recent guest coming back to dive a bit deeper. We've got Andy Felton again. He is the author of Nourished by Design, and he is going to be, we're going to be looking at some deeper issues if you want the full scope of who he is, or even to hear our preliminary conversation, I guess our original. It is now preliminary to this one. You can check out the other episode that's linked in the show notes. It's a fantastic episode. We go over a lot of things that have to do with his book, which we'll continue to do today. Andy, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Awesome. So we're going to dive right in because you and I, we can talk forever on all these things because they're such important topics. So we're going to kick this off with, what does it mean to be healthy?
That's a great question because Jesus is the divine physician. That's what this is one of the many different aspects of who he is as revealed in the Gospel of John. And so if our understanding of health doesn't take that into account, then we're probably not thinking about health in the right way. And there's a lot of different ways that you can think about it, that people do think about it from especially secular perspectives. And I think that they all are wanting in some way. And you can think about it in the the all-encompassing way that the World Health Organization does, and that includes all sorts of social factors and other
Hmm.
things, and it becomes so all-encompassing that it ends up meaning nothing. And then you can try to talk about it in these purely scientific terms that some people have tried to develop, and that also ends up becoming completely circular because it's built on nothing.
Hmm.
And so I think Karl Barth, the theologian from the 20th century, described this the best. And he described health as strength for human life. That's it. Strength for human life. And so if you think about what that means, I think the key words are human life. And when he talks about human life, he's talking about human life as revealed by Jesus, who is
Mm.
the perfect example of what it means to be a human, who lived the most flourishing human life that you can. And so our goods are revealed in Jesus. And um, basically, when you consider it that way, you can avoid these otherworldly uh, considerations on what health means, and you can bound it within a certain scope within the Christian life. And there are two kind of key um, I guess, adjustments to that definition that animate it. And the first one is that it's a good among goods. And so I think health is something that is limited. It is a
Hmm.
good that you can compare to other things. Sometimes your health is going to take precedence, and sometimes it's not. And for example, if you're on a missions trip and you're going to a country where there's
Hmm.
lots of malaria, right? You wouldn't sit on your couch and stay at home and try and be as healthy as possible when you could be doing the work that you're supposed to do.
Sure.
So you can compare health to other things. Um, but health also is not a good in itself. It is only good insofar as it supports a human life.
Mm.
And a human life includes different things for different people. Um, but it certainly includes the works that God has planned for you and giving you the strength to be able to do those works. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of how I think about health. That's how Bart thought about health. And that's the definition that I use in the book just to make sure that it's bounded and it's something that we can understand and kind of put within a Christian worldview.
That's so good. I love that. And that is very similar. We know we've talked before on the other episode, but my whole thing of doing this podcast and being vision-driven health is I think that health is for the purpose of what God has called us to do. And like you said, like that's different for different people. We each have different and unique callings. And I think that's putting health in its place because it can become this standalone thing, this end goal pursuit, and oftentimes the reasons behind one, the definition behind what health is, and two, the reasons behind it are very worldly and very either aesthetically focused or even just selfishly focused. And to put it in the framework of something that is one we can only really fully understand through Jesus, which amen, and that's everything. And a reason why your book is so great, because it echoes what's really true about all of life. But then two, that it has everything to do with what we're made for. So that's so good, and I think really sets a great stage for these other topics that we're going to shift into. And so you address something in your book with regard to God's, I guess you could say, interest in what we eat. And oftentimes people can kind of land on the idea that God doesn't really care what I eat as long as I'm thankful. I just got to be grateful for what I have. Like it's just a matter of, doing with what I have. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of attempts to answer this question, does God care what we eat?
Hmm.
And I think that there are a lot of ways, unfortunately, in which people have tried to answer this question and have ended up taking one of the many biblical metaphors using food or stories using food whether it's in the Old Testament or New Testament, and reading themselves into it, reading
Sure.
their desire for God to want to care what we eat into those stories. And while I think that the answer is yes, God certainly does care what we
Hmm.
eat, I think that that's not exactly the way of going about it.
Sure.
Most people do point to 1 Timothy 4:4 as essentially an encapsulation of what a Christian perspective on food looks like.
Hmm.
And like you said, there are these overarching themes of food freedom. Like I
Hmm.
am
Hmm.
free from the law. I am able to eat whatever I want, but it's also balanced by gratitude and thanksgiving.
Hmm.
Um, and so if those are the two major themes that we have, it's hard to derive exactly why God would care about us eating certain foods over other foods. And so that's why people have kind of used that freedom as a basis to say, okay, I can eat, microwavable chimichangas with gummy worms and Coke on the side, and God doesn't care about it as long as I'm thankful. Hallelujah.
Hmm.
Right? I don't think that's the case. And I think it has to do a lot with the character of God, what He's put us here for, and how He's revealed food to us. And so if you look at the practical, if we tie this back to health, right?
Yeah.
If God desires us to seek health as a limited good among other goods
Hmm.
for the purpose of enabling a fully Christian, a fully human life, then strength for that purpose, enabled by eating healthy foods, is a good thing, right? That
Hmm.
that is
Hmm.
one way to answer the question, does God care what we eat? But then if you look deeper than that too, if you understand how God reveals food throughout the entire arc of the biblical narrative,
Hmm.
you'll find that food is it's meant to testify not only to our neediness and how God satisfies our physical neediness,
Yeah.
but he uses that as an example, as an object lesson in how he satisfies all of our neediness, how he
Yeah.
is the true bread of life that nourishes us, body and soul, into eternity. And so chimichangas and gummy worms, that they might taste good, but they don't really testify to this idea of food being something that is nourishing and life-giving,
Hmm.
that reveals to us in a practical sense what God is doing in a spiritual sense when He nourishes us with His word, Jesus. So
Yeah.
there are so many different ways to answer that question, but most of them do not hinge on picking a verse or a passage out of the Bible and saying, see, God does care. It really is about understanding more about who God is and what He's revealed to us with food.
Yeah, I definitely I think that's such a great response. And I think even too, I mean, I guess you did mention the Timothy passage, but I don't really and we'll get into the Genesis Daniel. So sorry, I was about to say I don't understand what passages people would use to think otherwise, and then all of a sudden, like all the different ones just came to my mind. I was like, oh wait, no, people use a lot of different things. But I mean, I often talk about Leviticus 11, and people get hung up on the specifics of it. But like to your point of what what's the overarching dynamic to it, and so it's like God has this group of people who He's said, you will be a blessing to all nations, who's given a very specific, massive purpose to, and then gives them these very specific food and cleanliness laws. And the food laws, when you understand the animals that are forbidden, should people have consumed that, could have wiped out all of them. No blessing to the nations. Like they literally would all have like contracted some sort of nasty disease and died. And same thing with the cleanliness. Even too, it was really fascinating. I was looking into this a little bit a while ago during the bubonic plague, there was, which unfortunately there's been animosity towards Israel for many eons, but they were upset with the Jews in during the bubonic plague times because the Jews were not getting sick, and they weren't getting sick because they were just practicing the cleanliness laws, and that wasn't understood at that time. And so, to your point of health being for the purpose of living human life according to what we're called to, again, we come back to these things we're given to set up God's people in the most effective way to live that out. And that was what God saw fit at that time. And I think of even in Corinthians and the New Testament at large, you've got these Gentiles coming into play who have different food situations and whatnot. And like Paul is having to address like all the different things of like what's sacrificed, what's not. And just from a community standpoint, there were directions given, but it came back to what's edifying, what's helpful, what's beneficial, what's actually serving and loving and building everybody up to do this thing effectively. So I think, yeah, keeping those things in mind is so important because I think people are inclined to want to get hung up on a more specific dynamic to it. And I think people want to honestly not have to worry or feel bad about what they eat. And I think that would be missing the point as well.
Yeah, I think people want to read into it whatever their inclination is.
Sure.
To be healthy and eat well, they're going to look for anything that tells them any passage that they can point to that says you should be healthy, even if it's like tangentially related. Or if they want to just eat junk food and not worry about it, then they will look to other verses that say that there's food freedom and stuff like that. And I think both of those attempts kind of miss the point.
And that's so important too, just from an exegetical dynamic. I mean, when we're approaching God's word, we all have bias, period. Like it's impossible to come to God's word without bias. And therefore, it's so important to try to be aware of our bias and do a thorough reading and research not only on the cultural context, and at the end of the day, it's like who's talking, who are they talking to, why are they saying this? Not, oh, I read this and this sounds like this to me, which totally validates this thought that I have.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so and I will say I have personally been extremely guilty of doing such things because one, I didn't know, and then two, even after knowing, it's still an inclination because we think, you start to read a passage and it's like, oh, I think it means this, and we'll start to draw a conclusion before we even finish it without doing that intentional extra work. And so it's I say that as one, an offender myself, but then as two, that we can all continue to seek the Lord and seek the tools that we have, allow the Holy Spirit to reveal to us what's actually true. One of those health dynamics that both you and I have briefly touched on before, and I think are excited to talk about today, is there's this concept, this idea going around about the Garden of Eden diet is the most biblical diet. The idea is it was what Adam and Eve were told at the very beginning, the first people on earth, like, here is what you eat. And it was only because of sin that we eat any other way. Therefore, we should try to go back to the Garden of Eden. And this often parallels with the concept of the Daniel diet, which, people will read that, interpret. He was told to only eat vegetables, and he ended up being stronger and better. Therefore, we should follow that, and then like they'll usually go, which echoes the Garden of Eden. So we see that this is the best. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is another area where people, I think, misinterpret what is being communicated in Scripture.
hmm
And, um, I think people with a more of a vegan animal rights type bend will reflexively go back to Genesis 1.
hmm
And they say, essentially, the logic is that if God created this diet originally and it was good, well, then anything opposed to that would be not good.
Sure.
And that's very simple logic. And we understand that the conditions have changed, that the original diet, which was, what we would call a vegan diet, it was applicable in our pre-fallen condition, and we live now in a new reality. And so you have to take that into account, and that's why God gives all creatures into our hands in Genesis 9 after the flood. Um, New reality that applies now that we can never go back to being pre-fallen. But then
hmm
you also look at the new creation. We can strive towards the new creation in heaven.
hmm
And there is similar imagery in Isaiah talking about what heaven will be like and you look at passages where he talks about the wolf will lie with the lamb and there will be this
hmm
peace and harmony. And so it kind of gives you the impression that we're going back to this original Eden state where there's no meat eating, stuff like that. And so therefore we should practice that now.
Hmm.
I think that's wrong, partly because we are east of Eden and south of heaven. Like that's just where we are, and God has given us a command. He reinforces uh, that ability for us to eat
Hmm.
animals. It doesn't seem like he was doing that reluctantly because of our sin. Um, he was because there are times in the New Testament where Jesus does talk about Genesis 1 when it comes to like marriage. He says that Moses
Mm.
gave you divorce because of the hardness of your heart, but I tell you that in the beginning, this is
Mm.
how we did it. And so that's another area where you might look back, right?
Sure.
But God does not do that when it comes to food. Like in Peter's vision in Acts,
Right.
he's giving him these animals that were unclean according to the law, right? And he's saying, "Rise, kill, and eat." Like you will eat this animal, right? Um, so it's a recognition that God has a will for us now in this fallen, uh, an unredeemed, unfully redeemed state that we're in. And it includes the ability to faithfully consume meat. And I think that there is a caveat. What does faithfully consuming meat
Mm.
mean? We don't have to get into that right now, but I don't think that that means that we should just um, completely neglect animal. I'm not going to say rights per se, but stewarding animals
Right.
well,
Right.
allowing them to express the glory that they're designed to express. Um, but I don't think that we should shallowly look at Genesis 1 as like a prescription for how we're supposed to eat now. And I think so many people have made that leap, and it's just not correct. And that also assumes too that we're making the assumption based on Genesis 1 that the original diet was like a vegan diet, but there's actually a lot of room for speculation
Hmm.
um, because God never actually omits or he omits any mention of eating animals. He doesn't say you shall not eat animals. He just says I've given you this to eat,
Hmm.
but he doesn't say you can't eat this. The only thing he says you can't eat is the fruit of
Hmm.
the forbidden tree, right? So
Right.
um, and that's backed up by the fact that Abel was a keeper of sheep very early on. Like, what would be the purpose of having sheep other than, there's hides and sacrifice, but what about milk and meat? I don't know. Were those a part of that calculation? I'm not sure. Also, all of the animals in Genesis are described as eating plants too. But if you look at like lions and tigers and sharks, they can't eat plants. Like
Yeah.
there's just no way that they can eat plants. It's just not in their makeup to do so. So I think you have to understand what Genesis is trying to communicate to us and not take it too far.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are interesting speculations regarding Genesis and what was said and not said and what that could have meant, even to mentioning Cain and Abel and that they were keepers of sheep and whatnot. One thing that just in terms of that I do wonder if that provides more, I don't know if context is the right word, to what maybe the original intention was. I know in Genesis 9, after uh, Noah gets back on land after it's, rained for 40 days and whatnot. And God, says that every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things. And I don't necessarily know if that means like now I give you all things because it wasn't accessible before, or like if it's the world just got destroyed and so like now you can like use what's here because everything was literally just wiped out. But regardless, I guess of how that feeds into the speculation, it is an affirmation from God that all things, including animals, were an option for food. And then we see that obviously affirmed through the food laws and continued discussions of food moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There are so many ways to just read in things and I am speculating when it comes to whether, maybe animals were allowed in the pre-fallen condition. I think the preponderance of the evidence says that that's probably not the case.
Sure.
But I don't, what I'm trying to communicate is I don't think that that is the purpose of the text, is to communicate to
Yeah.
us what our diet should be, or exactly like what their diet was and why. I think it's there are deeper anthropological purposes about who God is and who we are that are communicated there. And that is not something that we need to draw out as like a prescription for what our diet looks like.
And that being another just emphasis to a biblical approach, just because a specific element is mentioned, it doesn't mean, like you said, that that's the purpose of the overall passage. Like there's mention of this is what's for food. Is Genesis 1 about what people should eat? Probably not. Like there's a much
Yeah,
bigger story at hand in Genesis 1 than like, hey, like this is the prescription. And even too, like it is, I guess in terms of how many verses are in that chapter, it's, I guess you could say it's what, I don't know, 2%, 5% of the verses like given to that, but we're definitely looking at a much larger overarching story. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we're reading scripture in general, like that every verse, every statement is placed within a greater understanding of that chapter, the book, and then the theme, obviously, of the Bible as a whole, which always does come back to Jesus. So, um,
exactly. And I guess one more point too is
yeah.
when we look at Isaiah, I mentioned how Isaiah
Oh, yeah.
prophesizes this idea of like this what some people think is like a meatless
Hmm.
heaven. Um, But then he also prophesies about heaven that it's going to be a banquet full of marrow uh,
Mm.
and rich wine, well aged. And so marrow, it's like, well, okay, well, according to our present worldly experience, the only way you can get marrow is by killing an animal.
Yeah.
Now that might be different in heaven.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe the wolf will lie with the lamb, and we will also be somehow eating marrow that doesn't require the death of an animal. I don't know.
Sure.
But I think that he's not trying to communicate this prescriptive diet. He's just trying to explain according to our current understanding, a picture of what heaven looks like,
Hmm.
right? And so yeah, you can't just take these things at face value exactly. You have to
Right.
understand what his purpose was in
Yeah.
writing that.
Yeah. For sure. For sure. So on this topic, so we've just addressed things from a biblical standpoint, but then people will, and I think it is important to look at things from a scientific, biological, etc. I think all of it is interconnected, but people will say, okay, cool. So let's just say, all right, the Bible gives way. We can have meat, but aren't cows bad for the environment? Doesn't like red meat increase your cholesterol? Isn't this like actually just generally bad for us anyways? Like, why would we participate in something that's not stewarding the earth? Why would we participate in something that is causing issues with our heart and our health and whatnot? So let's get into that.
Yeah, so I devote basically like 2 chapters to this discussion at the end of the book because there are so many arguments against meat. So we just talked about kind of the theological
Right,
perspective on meat, and so I that's a big chunk of it. And then there's like this health perspective as well.
right.
Um, Red meat is the devil incarnate. We've all been told throughout our whole lives, anyone who's lived post 1950, that
Yeah,
red meat is bad for you,
yeah,
that the saturated fat that comes with red meat will clog your arteries and you're going to die of a heart attack and your cholesterol is going to go up and all these horrible things associated with red meat when it comes to health. I think those have largely been debunked.
yeah.
And I explain why in the book. There's so many different ways to look at it. I think just if you look at the saturated fat and the cholesterol piece, people are coming around now with modern research on the intricacies of how we understand cholesterol and what we measure. It's not as simple as looking at
Right.
your panel from your annual physical that was
Mm-hmm.
free that had LDL and HDL, and the
Mm-hmm.
LDL is the bad stuff and the
Mm-hmm.
HDL is the good stuff. It's just not that simple. And so
Right.
um, the kind of LDL that increases when you eat saturated fat is not particularly bad for you. It's actually the kind of LDL that increases when you eat a lot of carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
That is the kind that is not as good for you, the kind that could potentially deposit on your arteries more readily, the kind that is more easily oxidized
Mm-hmm.
in your body. So just to keep it short, I think a lot of these factors when it comes to red meat are overblown. And while I don't like to look too prescriptively into the dietary law, it is worth pointing out that of the land animals that are considered clean, they are all red meat. Um, and so I'm not saying that we should look to the dietary law as a guide for eating today as like a scientific perspective, but I am saying that we should look and understand that God would not have given his people something to eat um, that was going to clog their arteries and kill them,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Um, so every ruminant is red meat.
Mm-hmm.
But then like there's so much more that could be said about the kind of the health side. But if you look at the other side that people attack meat from, specifically cows and other ruminants, it's that they burp a lot, and when they burp, they burp methane, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas that is way more much of a more greenhouse effect than CO2 does, and it stays in the atmosphere for like 10 years. And so, they say, hey, if cows are contributing all of this methane, how are we supposed to be stewards of this earth that God gave us if we're going to eat cows, right? It doesn't make sense. Um, and people will point to estimations that, cows contribute, they're all over the board, but I've heard them probably the best one is about 2 to 3% of our annual CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to cattle worldwide. And so that is a small number, but it's still a pretty big number when you think about like just in terms of how much
Sure.
that is.
Yeah.
Uh, but I guess the key point is that anyone who's considering these emissions from cattle as a part of our greenhouse gas emissions that are human caused, they are making a big mistake, a big fallacy, because cattle are a part of a biogenic carbon cycle, which means that when they're just one piece in this cycle. And so any of the greenhouse gases that they're emitting are eventually coming back down to Earth, and they're going into the grass. They're creating plant matter. And the cows are also there to facilitate creating the plant matter and then eating it. And then so they're just a part of this big circle. And so there are no net emissions from cattle. The net emissions are zero because you're using the same old carbon atoms over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's just a complete fallacy to consider cattle emissions as a part of these other emissions, which, when we're talking about fossil fuels, we're actually digging up these new carbon atoms that were not previously released. They were not a part of the cycle, and we're adding them into the cycle. That's where we're getting this new carbon from, and that's what's act to any sort of warming effect that, you could debate it. But if there is such an effect going on due to man-made carbon emissions, it would not be from the cattle. It would be from this new carbon that we're essentially unearthing. Um, and then if we're going to solve that somehow, people have proposed carbon capture technology, which is completely unscalable on the level that they need it to carbon out of the air at the rate that we're putting it in there. But actually, cattle are amazing at putting this carbon back in the ground, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so you look at regenerative agriculture, and there's this farm, for example, White Oak Pastures in
Mm-hmm.
Georgia. You've probably heard of it. Yeah, they're
Mm-hmm.
they're pretty popular. Um, there's a statistic they did a life cycle analysis of their beef, and their beef actually put 3.5 kilograms of CO2 back in the ground for every kilogram of beef produced.
Mm-hmm.
So they're a net uh, taking carbon out of the air.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look at the fake meat companies that have comparable burgers, they're actually adding 3.5 kilograms of CO2 to the environment for every kilogram of meat,
Quote
fake meat
unquote.
that
Yeah.
they produce. And so you'd have to actually eat one of these regeneratively farmed burgers to offset your emissions from the supposedly green, healthy, that's a totally different story, fake meat burgers, right? So it's just
Yeah.
a total, any way you attack this issue, um, it just ends up caving in on itself. But that's why I spend so much time talking about it, because all of these issues are things that people talk about, and they're all a big piece of a holistic understanding of nutrition from a
hmm
Christian perspective. So
hmm
yeah, it's all fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. And to kind of, I guess, emphasize more of this point on from the environmental standpoint, but the environmental standpoint comes back to stewardship, right? And I think going back to Genesis 1, people will use uh the call from God to Adam and Eve and humanity at large to like go and um some translations say steward, others say what do they say?
Well, take dominion.
Dominion.
Yeah, it's the
Right.
cultural mandate is what it's
Right.
referred to as, right?
Right. And so then people think like, oh, like this is like dominion, like we just kind of like take and pillage versus like we take and we steward, we tend, we care for. And I think the concern about the cow burps is is coming from a good place, particularly if you want to steward the earth. But then like you're saying, we do have to look at the actual research and I have, some good friends who are vegan and they're passionate about the animals, they're passionate about the environment. And to your point, like, and like I've seen some really, I think, helpful ways to look at it. And I'm sure you include something to this effect in your book, but so you have one giant cow that's participating in this carbon cycle of sequestering carbon, putting it back into the earth, addressing the issue of its births and, participating in this incredible God created cycle. One giant cow can feed, I don't even know, like dozens of people from the one dead cow, whereas this fake burger that's comprised of all kinds of random plants and vegetable oils, and those plants and vegetable oils were largely produced through the conventional agricultural means, which included the harmful processes of monoculture and also or monocrop processes. It has the pesticides, the herbicides, and then, the pesticides and herbicides that address and kill the hundreds of thousands of little critters that may have even ended up in these burgers in some capacity. And it's like we have one cow that's helping heal the environment that feeds dozens. And then we have hundreds of thousands of little creatures that participate in harming the environment and then also creating this one arguably harmful, quote unquote, meat burger. And the contrast between the two is just, once you understand it, I think a no-brainer on which is the more proper stewardship, not only of the environment, but of our bodies and our health and well-being.
Yeah, exactly. And I do get into this, which I think is a pagan god, essentially. And we're told to, you talked about mandate, how we have dominion, and people kind of think that you can rape and pillage the earth because what dominion means. And then also dominion is supposed to be balanced with keeping the garden, right? That was the first task that was given to Adam, is to keep and dress the garden.
Yeah.
So there's this care that's balanced with our dominion that ends up with this stewardship, like you're talking about, which is supposed to be a holistic stewardship that promotes human flourishing, but not at the expense of the environment, because the
hmm
environment is intended to, and the creatures that are given to us as well, because these things are things that enable us to be fully human as well.
Right.
And then yeah, like you
Right.
said, there's so many. Yeah, how much does a single patty, when you have a monoculture with all these pesticides and the amount of pollinators that you're killing and the amount of microbes that you're killing. I mean, talk about trillions of microbes. Um, the questions become, how do you weigh these things morally? And that's the other area that
Mm-hmm.
people talk about, is
Mm-hmm.
this kind of violence perspective. I'm vegan because I don't like violence. It's like, okay, you find me a supposedly vegan farmer, like that hasn't killed, that hasn't been trapping because they can't use pesticides and things like that, that hasn't, you know,
Harmed some
it's
little living
impossible.
creature. Yeah, in
Yeah,
some
everyone
way.
who's ever tried it, there are so many attempts. Uh, it's just, it doesn't happen. There's no such thing as a non-violent food production system. And there's actually a lot of research that goes into that, that I quote in the book, that there's some school of agriculture at one of these colleges talks about how the vegan model is actually not the model that produces the least loss of life, or the,
Mm-hmm.
however you want to
Exactly.
discuss it. So, yeah, there's really no redeemed argument for anything when it comes to the health, the environmental perspective, the theological perspective, or this kind of anti-violence pacifist perspective
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to meat, that I think really holds water.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. To kind of circle back more into the health dynamic, though, there's, I think I even remember, actually, fun fact of, about the vegan perspective. Ryan and I on our honeymoon, we went to this like vegan smoothie bar. We were in Hawaii, and they had the documentary Forks Over Knives as like a like you could watch it thing. And I was like super into health then, just kind of like getting started. And like ruined our honeymoon and watched that movie. And I was like, oh no. Like, and I was so convinced by it. Um, which yeah, a humbling moment. It's compelling the way that they put it together. I think when you know how to assess things differently, it's a different dynamic. But so I was like, oh no. And one of the things I remember them saying was something to the effect, granted, this was 10 years ago, but something to the effect of like even meat and oh yeah, because they're and obviously they're super against cheese and dairy and all those different things. Like all of those are not only contributing to heart issues, but also like diabetes. Like they like put all the chronic diseases as as outcomes of these animal products. Um, so kind of to segue, we don't necessarily have to go into how the well, if you want to. What I want to get at is let's talk about chronic disease. Let's talk about, if someone has pre-diabetes, are they only at risk for disease? Like, what are the other dynamics of that? We've got, we're in a culture in a day and age where chronic disease is what's taking us out. It's not infectious disease. It's not, getting eaten by a lion. Like, unfortunately, we're in an epidemic of chronic disease that is by and large brought on by lifestyle induced choices. And I talk about this a ton on my podcast, and I always say, like, I don't say it of like, shame on you guys, you like brought this on yourselves. We're in a culture, we're in a system, we're swimming in the water of chronic disease because we just, what's available and what we know funnels us that direction. So let's talk. So I say all of that, let's bring it back to a person with prediabetes is only at risk of disease. Let's start unpacking the metabolic dynamic.
Yeah, so there is this kind of misnomer out there that pre-diabetes, like you said, is you're just at risk of a disease. It's not actually a disease itself. Once you get to
Mm,
diabetes, that's the disease,
yeah, yeah.
right? And so they diagnose these things based on your fasting blood sugar and your blood glucose. And so once you get to 100, 100 to 125 is considered this realm of pre-diabetes, and then
Hmm.
126 and above is considered full-blown diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Um, and I would rephrase that to consider that prediabetes is just simply metabolic dysfunction,
Right,
and
right,
diabetes is just highly advanced metabolic dysfunction.
right. Totally.
But it's all along the same spectrum. And you can even have pre-diabetes, or not have pre-diabetes. You can be under 100 on your fasting glucose and still have fairly advanced metabolic dysfunction that
Right,
just hasn't quite caught up yet.
right.
And so when people are, the problem is that we're looking at glucose in the blood as this primary indicator, but glucose is severely lagging insulin resistance. Insulin resistance will manifest for a long time before glucose ever really gets to the point where it's starting to rise. And
Mm-hmm.
that's because,
Right.
insulin in your blood, it gets produced to pack these glucose molecules in your bloodstream into any cell that will take them. It's
Mm-hmm.
trying to lower blood sugar because having high blood sugar is objectively bad for you. It's toxic. Glucose is toxic in your blood. It's necessary in your blood. You have to have it to fuel your cells, but it's toxic in your blood when it's in high concentrations because it's also very sticky and it sticks onto everything and it disrupts the function of every cell in your body. And so you're trying to keep this delicate balance, and insulin is there to rescue you from high blood sugar by pumping this sugar into any cell that'll take it. And the problem is that insulin can do its job ineffectively for a long period before you know it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the problem is that people are not actually getting regular insulin tests. They're just getting glucose. And so they might think that they're totally fine. And instead, they should be getting an insulin test. And they could see, even if they have normal blood sugar, let's say they have like 80 or
Mm-hmm.
85,
Mm-hmm.
and that's considered normal. Um, they could have insulin that's slowly creeping up over time because it's
Right.
becoming less and less efficient. Your
Right.
cells are saying, I don't want any more glucose,
Yeah.
and your insulin is going higher and higher to say,
Right.
no, no, you will have this glucose.
Yeah.
And it's going back and forth. And, so the moral of the story is that once glucose has gone up in your blood to a point where it's reaching one of these thresholds,
Mm-hmm.
you have a deeply dysfunctional metabolism. And that's not
Mm-hmm.
to scare anyone. That's just to say that we need to do a better job of screening. People need to make sure that they're getting proper blood work that
Right.
tests insulin and tests inflammation and all these other things, so that you know exactly where you are and you can start to pursue whatever lifestyle changes need to happen to make sure that you're not getting to these disease states, right? Where like pre-diabetes or diabetes.
Yeah. And even too, obviously, yeah, people don't need to be scared about it. I think the hope about it is it's something that's very reversible, and I don't think that that's emphasized in the standard kind of medical system. There, it's like, oh, like you're pre-diabetic, and I think the pre-diabetic state, they're like, okay, well, let's try and work on it. They don't usually give much advice on how to do that, but just like work on it, like exercise and eat healthier, but eat healthier according to the horrible USDA guidelines that we adjusted a little bit last time, and people are like, okay, and then oftentimes nothing improves because they aren't equipped well, and then they end up with the diabetes, and then it's kind of like, okay, well, you're here, so you're going to be forever on insulin. And then even too, I think they know. I think this is where we want to kind of head to. So diabetes, if someone gets to the point of diabetes, is that the end if nothing changes with their diet? Is that, where do you think people head?
Yeah, I mean, you were just talking about how they're going to give you more insulin when you have type 2 diabetes, which is, I think people are maybe starting to realize, at least some people are realizing that that is not a good course of action because insulin, there's this vicious cycle. And if you have, it's funny enough that high insulin levels in your blood will actually make you more insulin resistant. And so you'll become more insulin resistant, and then so you'll pump out more insulin, and then you become more insulin resistant, and you get to the point where you can't pump out any more insulin, and so they give you insulin, and so now you're just becoming more insulin resistant because of the stuff that they're giving you. And so it's when they're giving you insulin because you've been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which is kind of the standard of care. They're doing the exact opposite of what needs to happen. But like you said, there is hope for people who are diagnosed with this because this is a reversible condition. There are all sorts of testimonies of people completely reversing their diabetes or their pre-diabetes or whatever, which is all just metabolic dysfunction
Hmm. Hmm.
by these lifestyle factors. And it's not all diet.
No.
There is exercise, there's
Hmm.
appropriate relationship with sunlight, there's
Hmm.
sleep. All of these things are a part of a larger scheme. But diet is probably perhaps the biggest driver, I think. Um, and so it's really about just feeding our cells, fixing the cellular dysfunction that's causing this disease, right? That every chronic disease that we have is a manifestation of metabolic dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
There is no disease, whether it's infertility or mental health issues or heart disease or any other arthritis, everything is a manifestation of this simple cellular inability to produce efficient energy and clean up waste products. Like that is it. And that's great to know because if you can tailor your diet to give your cells the right inputs so that it can do those things effectively, then you can prevent or reverse basically all chronic disease.
Yeah.
Um, it's a very empowering and liberating understanding of disease.
Yeah. And I know we could go so much deeper on that, and I hope people are hearing. One, it comes down to the metabolic dysfunction. Diabetes, unfortunately, usually isn't the end. Oftentimes, I think diabetes is the precursor to a lot of heart issues. We see diabetes and heart disease are go hand in hand, and all the others, it all goes hand in hand because it does come back to metabolic dysfunction, which largely increases your inflammation and a variety of other things. Your body is not functioning the way God designed, therefore things start breaking down. However, like you said, diet makes a huge difference. If we can get those inputs right, it's going to be able to shift how we experience those things. So, can we, as we're wrapping up, I would definitely want to get into people are like, okay, what's the food? What do I do? Like we've addressed like all the different things. What are some foods we want to get out of our diet that are contributing to these issues?
Yeah, there are some big, I guess, just categories of foods. The first one being highly refined carbohydrates, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's table sugar or any other kind of sugar that is not, from a potato or
Mm-hmm.
from freshly milled grains or, some other like whole type food. We should get those out of the diet as much as possible. I know
Right.
that one's kind of one of those ones that you can't fully remove, but it's just good to be conscious of them, I
Yeah.
think. Um, I think the ultra processed oils, some people call them seed oils, some people
Mm-hmm.
call them vegetable oils.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there are eight that Dr. Kate Shanahan, I'm sure your
Mm-hmm.
audience is very familiar with her, refers to as like the hateful eight. I would get those out of the diet completely if possible.
Can you list
Um,
them for those who don't know what they are?
yeah, so there are three C's and three S's and then two more. So there's corn,
Nice.
cottonseed, and canola oil, which
Uh-huh.
canola is like the one that for whatever reason people are told is like healthy. I don't understand that
It's
at
probably the
all.
worst one.
Yeah. And then there's soybean, sunflower, safflower. And then the last two escape me, but they're you can
Grapeseed
look them up.
oil
Yeah, grapeseed and
and
there's one more. Anyway,
yeah,
the soybean, sunflower and canola seem to be the common offenders, I think. So if you can just remember those especially.
yeah.
But I would look up that list of the hateful eight. Really any oil that's not a good oil. I just, that's why I don't remember them all because if I'm seeing any sort of wrapper or something that has um, anything other than like coconut oil or extra virgin olive oil, any like natural oil that's easily freshly squeezed out without heavy
Hmm.
processing and chemicals, those are going to be the ones that you'd want to look for.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that would be the second big thing. Another big one is these chemicals. We talked about it earlier, pesticides,
Hmm.
herbicides, Roundup or glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup, is the one that gets sprayed the most. And that's why they make GMO foods is to be able to resist Roundup. And so you see GMOs and Roundup, they go hand in hand. And
Hmm.
so if you're avoiding one, you're likely avoiding the other most of the time, but not always. And so the easiest way to avoid these is to read the environmental working groups, Clean 15
Hmm.
and Dirty Dozen. And
Hmm.
so the Dirty Dozen are going to be the ones that, of the tested foods that they analyze every year, organic, they would be the ones that have the most pesticide residues, and then the
Hmm.
clean 15 would be the ones that have the least. And so
Right.
you can look at strawberries, blueberries, there's spinach. Those are always like the common offenders. Those are the
Hmm.
ones that you do not buy unless they're organic.
Right,
Um,
right. Don't do it.
or otherwise not treated with pesticides if they're not explicitly organic. And then there's like avocados, onions, sweet potatoes. Those are ones that you can usually get away with because they're typically on the clean 15.
Hmm.
And so if you want to go a little bit cheaper on those ones, you can do that without ingesting a bunch of pesticides.
Hmm. Hmm.
The last one is I have some commonly um, it's commonly assumed that supplements, well, I think supplements are generally good if they're targeted and specific and there's a purpose for them. There's a lot of discussion there, but there are ones that I think a lot of people take that are potentially um, counter-effective, and I list those. There's like a handful of them that I list in the book as well, but
Hmm.
there are some things that you should really look into when you're with the supplement regimens as well.
Yeah. So I think those are really solid, basic and doable things to avoid dietary wise. Try to get organic as much as possible. Look for things for the GMO, and then yeah, it might be more simple to remember the healthy oils. So cotton, or not cotton, con, con, coconut oil, coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil. A lot. Sometimes people are starting to use tallow. That's,
Yeah,
a good
yeah,
option as
that's
well.
fantastic.
It is, yeah. Even I don't know what things are like in your neck of the woods, but here in Southern California, a lot of fast food chains are doing tallow fries, which is like awesome and dangerous. Or like even too, you go to um, local health grocery stores and they've got the potato chips fried in coconut oil or avocado oil. So it's like if you want to indulge in a like healthier version of a snack. Like they've got it's devoid of at least the bad oils.
And they taste
So
better. It's not about restriction. It's about just picking the right
they
stuff,
taste
right?
amazing.
Yeah, they taste way better.
They're so good. So yeah, that's super helpful. So then we've got a few things to watch out for. What would you say? I know you've got kind of a here's when you're putting together your plate, how you want to kind of structure your meal. What does that look like?
Yeah, and it's not like a prescriptive diet plan per se. It could be conducive to any type of diet that you might do, but it's more of like, and it's not also like this percentage of your plate should be this and this percentage should be this. But I just talk about these five pillars of your plate, things that like you should be trying to get in your diet as much as possible, things that should be the basis of your diet. And the first one is quality protein. I think the protein recommendations are just woefully inadequate, and people should be consuming a lot more protein
Right.
than at least the recommendations would suggest. And that needs to be a priority. If you're going to do that in today's food culture, you have to actually like seek protein. Like what kind of protein am I going to eat in this meal?
Right, right. Every snack, every meal has to have a significant amount of protein to get anywhere near what you need.
Yeah, exactly. And so that would be the first main pillar. The second one would be natural fats. So as opposed to the ultra processed oils, which are these kind of unnatural, like they were maybe once natural, but they've been
Started
completely
out.
destroyed since then.
Yeah.
As opposed to those, you look at like what we were talking about, the avocado oils, the beef tallows, the creams, and just the meat on your steak, and any natural fat, whether it's saturated or monounsaturated or polyunsaturated, is going to have a place in your diet, right? It should. That doesn't need to mean you need to like go way overboard and just eat like 80% fat or something like that. You don't have, some people can do that if it's like a targeted metabolic fix, but most people don't need to do that. But we should not be afraid of fat, and
Yeah.
and fat comes with protein. Protein tends to come with fat. There's
Sure,
very few
sure.
sources of protein that don't have fat, and so dispelling that notion of you have to eat lean meats.
Right.
Beef is just fine, and we already
Yeah.
talked about why beef is
Yeah.
fine too. So it all kind of comes full circle. Um, I also talk about fiber and fermented foods being the other two big ones. Not only do they add flavor and help fill you up in satiety, but they are wonderful for your gut and your microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them have different effects, but they're complementary.
Mm-hmm.
And then to counteract some of the, I think the unwise supplements, I do have some micronutrients
Mm-hmm.
that people should be looking for in their diets, whether it's through their diet or if they need a supplement as necessary. And those would be things like whole food vitamin C as opposed to vitamin C that's produced in a lab.
Mm-hmm.
Magnesium is a big one to counter effect all the stressors in our daily lives. Um, and so there are a handful of other ones that I talk about, with those two being, some of the biggest ones, but that'll come from, any really nutrient dense food, whether it's like liver or desiccated liver supplements, things like that, which I
Yeah,
take because I personally don't eat liver every day.
same.
Um, you know, avocados have a lot. There's tons of good foods out there that have those, but we should really be seeking micronutrient density as much as possible, in addition to those kind of macronutrients that I was talking about. So, yeah, so those would be like the five pillars of the plate.
Love it. I think those are so, so helpful and so good. When you told me them on our other call, I was like, oh, this is perfect. These are so good. I think it encompasses really, if we're looking at things from a nutrient density standpoint, and obviously your book is about nourishment and having a Christ-centered uh, nourishment, I think those five pillars really hit it. And if people can honestly boil it down to that and focus on that, and kind of make it less complicated. I know we talked a bit about this in our last conversation of like food is a gift, food tastes good, like God's given us food. And so it's like, okay, well, let me enjoy food with these pillars. Let me enjoy some protein, some fats. Like fermented foods can get really fun. One, when you start to ferment things yourself, it's actually amazing how many different kinds of things you can ferment and the flavors you can add to it and how that really complements meals. I think that actually it can complement meat really well. It just becomes fun and it's serving your body and it's nourishing it, undoing these metabolic issues and dynamics. It's actually a really beautiful thing. So, um, yeah, Andy, it's been such a joy. And again, I emphasize like this is all that Andy is speaking from his book. Like this is all in his book. He's got more detail on it. I think it's such a valuable resource. Again, it's Nourished by Design, a Christ-centered approach to nutrition. You can get it on Amazon. You've got a workbook for it. Do you want to wrap up? Tell us a little bit more about where people can find it and just give your emphasis on it for us.
Yeah, well, it comes back to what we talked about in the beginning. Like, when you answer this question of does God care what we eat, it's
Mm,
about what is food meant to communicate to us. It's a gift. You talked about it,
hmm.
right? The pillars emphasize it. We're talking about flavorful and healthy foods, right? And if
Yeah,
you have the science right, those things are not opposed to each other.
right.
And when you understand the theology piece of what food is meant to be for us, you walk away with a cohesive narrative on how we're supposed to nourish ourselves. And so that's the message I try and communicate in the book. Like you said, it is available on Amazon, hardcover, softcover, ebook, and I have a website called nourishedbydesignbook.com that has a free resource and can also give you a link to either contact me or go to the Amazon page for the book. So yeah, if you're interested, I'd really appreciate the support and think that it can really help people as they try and navigate this broken food culture that we have.
For sure, for sure. Yeah. Get your book club on it, start a small group over it. This is definitely a valuable resource. Thank you so much again, Andy. Appreciate you for being on.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you so much for listening to the Vision Driven Health podcast today. I hope this episode inspired you, supported you, and blessed you in some way. If it did, it would mean the world if you would leave a 5-star written review on Apple Podcast and share this episode on your social media. The more reviews and shares this gets, the more people can be blessed and encouraged in creating a Jesus-centered, sustainable, healthy lifestyle. If you want to hang with me and other Jesus-loving ladies who are creating healthy habits that last, be sure to join my free Facebook group, the Made Well Mastermind. Use the link in the show notes to join. Be blessed with hope, joy, and health. I'll see you next week.